Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Richardson. I am a Senior User Experience Architect here at Infragistics. Before I start talking about my topic today, which is designing for responsive design, I just want to give you a little bit of background about myself. I've been doing this for quite a while. I have experience across business verticals involved in the areas of research, evaluation, design, management, but all of those things in the area of innovative user-centered solutions. And then on the weekends, you can go check out my blogs on the Infragistics website or the D3 website. I also race motorcycles for Infragistics, and I'm at a number of different tracks around the East Coast all summer long. In this talk today, I want to set some expectations before we begin. This is not a talk about the mechanics of creating responsive websites. I am not a developer, as I mentioned. I am a user experience architect. You may know that by other titles, human factors, design research. I am not a developer. I can point you to other interesting Infragistics webinars about the mechanics of creating responsive websites, particularly if you go to the Infragistics YouTube site and look for a presentation by Tommy Rausch. What I do want to talk about today is how this topic applies to internal business applications and complex transactional websites. Now, you're thinking, why not marketing sites or informational websites like Starbucks that I have shown here below? There are a couple of reasons for that. No offense, but marketing and informational websites are fairly well understood nowadays, to the point where they are becoming commodities. There are a wide range of templates available that you can use to support the display of these sites on a number of different hardware platforms that span quite a variety of standard designs. In addition, the content of these sites is typically more important to the site owner rather than the user. Use Starbucks, for example. I'm sure there's a lot of content on the Starbucks website that is important to somebody at Starbucks, otherwise it wouldn't be on the website, that perhaps is only of marginal importance to me. And that this idea of responsive design, as we currently understand it, is there specifically to increase the commoditization of these sites. And for that reason, I want to focus on internal business apps and complex transactional sites because they present a challenge to this idea of designing for multiple devices. My talk then will be divided into three parts. I will speak about responsive design, adaptive design, or designed, and I want to make a distinction between those things. I want to focus on what I think is the real problem that many folks don't recognize. And then I want to end by talking about what you should be doing when you are involved in the creation of a new site for a complex piece of software or a complex transactional website, whether it's from a designer's perspective or a UX architect, research, HF perspective, or from a development perspective. So let's dive right in. Responsive, adaptive, or designed. It's important to step back for a moment and just consider where we've been in order to understand where we are now. Back in the good old days of pre-2007, there were desktops, there were laptops, and when you were designing an application or a website, you had a pretty good idea of where this thing was going to live when you were done with it. There were monitors of different sizes, fine. There were different resolutions, fine. But in general, people were using these things at their desk, maybe at their couch, but mostly we had a good understanding of where people were, why they were using them, and the environment in which these things lived. And then came the iPhone, an entirely different device, a different size screen, a different resolution, and a different set of needs, a different set of requirements from the user's perspective. Then things start to get a little complicated. Then we've got Android coming out around 2008, the new iPhone 3G, and all right, so now we've got a couple of devices, a couple of resolutions. But then now we've got lots of Android manufacturers. Now we've got lots of phones, different sizes, different resolutions. The new iPhone comes out, and oh my goodness, now we've got lots of different Android manufacturers, lots of different variations in display technology. The iPhone 4, and if that wasn't bad enough, oh, now we've got the iPhone 5. And then don't forget tablets, which just adds to all of this. My point here is that we have this problem. And the problem are these pesky users who carry their phones and their tablets with them all the time. And if that wasn't bad enough, they expect to be able to use these things in place of their office computer whenever it's convenient for them. Sheesh. For instance, and these are real-life examples I have personally come across. Large cable company I was doing work for had employees that wanted to be able to finish certain SAP CRM-related tasks on the train ride home. I worked with a sales team who wanted to enter prospective client information into Salesforce from the parking lot after their meetings rather than wait until they got back to their office. And me personally, I'd rather enter my weekly timesheet from my couch on Sunday nights than take time out of my workday on Friday to do it. All of these different situations are using different devices, and they are different environments, and my particular set of requirements around these tasks in these environments differs. Programmatically, we look for solutions to these things. And the question here is, how do we design for different devices cheaply without redesigning? It becomes impractical to create different variants of an application or a website to be displayed across these different devices, even in fact if it's possible to have each device identify itself. But what we want to do is minimize the amount of rework, the amount of tweaking that's necessary. And this idea of responsive design came about as a solution to this problem, if you will, right? How do we get around the fact that users are using all these different devices in all these different environments, yet still want to do things on applications or websites that may have been originally designed for a single display modality, regardless of which one that happened to have been. The two terms that are being bandied about today are responsive design and adaptive design. I have definitions here for the sake of completeness. To me, it appears still that there is enough fluidity between these two things that for the non-developer like myself, they're roughly equivalent. The idea being that I want to create something in the code that allows the size and resolution of the device to tell the code how to basically rejigger its contents so that it will display well on the particular device the user is holding. Now, what I want to spend a moment here to talk about is how these programmatic solutions address this problem. One thing is clear, right? Each method, whether we're talking about responsive design or adaptive design, it doesn't matter, programmatically decides how to modify an original design to fit a new set of constraints, a new set of size and resolution requirements specific to a device. But because it's a programmatic solution, it needs to presume that the user needs basically the same sort of thing, same access to the application, the same breadth of functionality, but organized differently. Now, regardless of how we define responsive versus adaptive, regardless of the code that's going on to accomplish those things, the point I want to drive home is that neither addresses the issue of design. And what do I mean by that? I mean that programmatic solutions attempt to solve for a display problem. Programmatic solutions attempt to solve for a usability problem. Can I find the thing I'm looking for, or is it now too small or too jumbled to find? Programmatic solutions, however, don't solve for usefulness. And I want to spend a moment talking about that because that issue there gets to the real underlying problem of users needing multiple devices in multiple environments to accomplish perhaps different tasks. So what is the real problem here? What I would suggest to you is that the real problem is that there are, in fact, two problems. The first is technology-centered. How do I get my application to display correctly across multiple devices and still make it such that I don't break the bank trying to do this thing in time or money? And that's a relatively straightforward problem now. It depends on maybe who you talk to, but as, again, a non-developer, it's a relatively straight problem. I need to define beforehand the variations in my display, and I invoke these rules when certain devices, when my application is being shown on certain devices, when those devices require them. User-centered design is the other problem here. How do I know what users need as their contexts of use and devices change? It is not enough simply to say, I'm going to give you SAP's CRM module on your phone, and I'll stack everything vertically instead of laying everything out in a typical horizontal navigation. Why? Well, although you may be giving me access to everything, what that programmatic solution ignores is that what I need to do when I'm using SAP's CRM module on my phone on the train is, to some extent, separate or fundamentally different than how I would use that application, what I would use that application for if I was sitting in my office. And in order to solve a user-centered problem, it's necessary to conduct the necessary research in order to determine what those requirements are and create the parameters for that design in order to support those requirements. So notice, I'm not saying that the solution to a multi-device world is to create unique variants to address each device's requirements. Not at all. In fact, the technology design-centered solution is, in my opinion, the correct one. What's missing here is the requirements gathering process, the design process, to inform that technology-centered solution. So, to sum this up, responsive display, if you will, is a technological solution to a technological problem. User-centered design is a design solution to a human problem, and these two things have to be considered in tandem in order for either one to be workable in today's world. What does that mean then? Well, it means that variable contexts equate to variable requirements. You cannot assume that my use of a device in one environment is going to have the same set of requirements as my use of a device in another. Tasks in these situations are likely to be qualitatively different in these different contexts, especially as I move from desktop to mobile and back again. For instance, there are electronic medical records, electronic health record software out there, and they have all sorts of functionality, but by and large, they still fail this test of usefulness because they don't take advantage of the fact or recognize the fact that the users of this software have different requirements as they move from place to place. A physician collecting patient information in his or her office is going to have a very different set of needs, a very different set of requirements than that same physician collecting that same patient information in a hospital room or an emergency room. Simply taking that piece of software and resizing it to fit from a desktop to perhaps a tablet to perhaps a phone is going to be insufficient to meet the needs of that individual as their situations vary. One of the things that really bugs me about responsive design being touted as something of a panacea is that it ignores what users need to accomplish as they move from situation to situation. And simply making a website usable or an application usable on different devices ignores what I'm trying to do. It ignores my needs in that situation. Again, keep in mind, I'm not suggesting that what we need are multiple applications designed specifically for devices. What I'm saying is that you need a sufficient body of user research in each of those situations to provide the requirements that responsive design technology can implement. For those not in the user experience world as either a user experience architect or a researcher or a designer, this may be something of news, that design itself is a process. And using design as a solution here, while not new, is important to keep in mind because it bridges the gap between the business and the technology and the user's requirements. And it does so by remaining mindful of legacy systems, of existing features and functions, but it coordinates that with an understanding of who's using this thing and why, and how that changes when the questions of where and when come up. And it associates those with what the user needs to accomplish. Design also allows different interaction models to be explored. what may be a very useful drop-down menu on a website may be very inefficient for someone who's looking to make a very quick choice on a phone because they simply don't have the luxury of time that I might have sitting at my desk. So things like this. It also allows fast, early, and iterative validation. In the big world of software development, user research and design is cheap and quick. So, programmatic solutions as they stand today are a little bit dangerous. One size does not fit all. If I designed an application for a desktop or a laptop, hey, I might have something that is both usable and useful, and my users might have a good experience. Simply translating that to an iPad or somebody else's tablet or a mobile phone, simply squeezing it into the available space, right? Not usable. It's also not useful. It's a bad experience. Responsive design, though, as I'm trying to show here, doesn't really resolve that problem. I still have my initial site, which is both useful and usable on its initial device targets. And I may now have usable versions on the tablet and the mobile phone. But because it doesn't take advantage, it doesn't acknowledge the reasons why I'm using that application in that situation on that device, it becomes not useful. It's irrelevant to me if I can find everything. It may not be convenient for me to do so. It may not be relevant for me to do so, leading to that same bad experience, which is in fact exactly the sort of thing you're seeing with users of electronic medical record software now. That things are perhaps usable, taken in isolation, but put in context, become not useful. What is a good experience then? Pleasing and usable access to content across different devices is kind of what's touted by responsive design today. And what I want to reinforce here is that that is not the case. If it were, we could all download a great WordPress theme and go home early. Good experience is a solution that's based on understanding what the user's goals are as they interact with an application under different conditions and on different devices. It supports changing requirements as those conditions and devices change, and it's both usable and useful. And those two things are very different. And as I showed on slide 2 previous, it is possible to be usable but not useful. What should you be doing then? Well, you should know that usability is not enough. I can create usable features, components, functions, all these nice little pieces, and put them together into a system that remains usable, but is no longer useful to me. And the key here is keeping in mind that the design process defines those parameters to be implemented by a programmatic solution. It determines what needs to be displayed, what things are more important than other things, how do interactions models need to change as I move from my office to my train, to my couch, to the ER, right? And that shuffling layout alone is not enough. And yeah, all right, so this is a bit of a goof here. A doctor today using a tablet, which is becoming extremely commonplace, and good old Dr. McCoy using his tricorder. But think about it. they both had the same issue. And kudos to Star Trek for figuring this out way back when. You don't see either of them dragging some version of a desktop around with them as they wander the halls or some alien planet. They take a device that is specifically suited to the environment. Why? Why would you force them to take software on that device that is not specifically suited to that environment? And with that, I will leave you, and hopefully you'll remember this last slide if nothing else. I have two more slides that I just want to show you quickly. One is a stepwise definition of a design approach. I will leave this for a moment. I don't need to read through the whole thing, but it just describes in some detail what the design approach is and what designers and user experience researchers are doing in this process, and hopefully gives you some idea of how, while it may take a short amount of time up front that perhaps you weren't planning on, it will in fact save you an enormous amount of time and user anguish on the back end. And then finally, this last thought, that well-designed software requires design. Research and design and technology together form the bridge between the business, the user, and the technology stakeholders to create something that meets the user's needs as they move from situation to situation. Our job has become much more difficult and much more interesting in that now we need to understand not only the requirements around the software proper, but how those requirements change across environments. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar about responsive design, and I hope to be able to speak to you again very, very soon. Thanks very much.